Armed with the knowledge that we covered in the last lesson, let's create some brushes. Creating your own brushes from scratch is a lot of fun, and it can save you time too. If you need a specific type of brush that you don't already have, it's a lot faster to create one from scratch or edit one of your existing brushes than it is to go online and try to find a brand new brush that suits your needs. So let's take a look at how to create our own custom brushes. As we discussed before, Photoshop's brush engine is based entirely around brush stamps. So if we're going to create our own custom brushes, we have to first create our own custom brush stamps. You can do this with any image you want to use. I'll start with this simple circle here. Once you have your stamp ready, all you have to do is go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. You can give your brush a name if you want, and click OK. Once your brush has been created, you'll find it at the bottom of your Brushes menu, which you can access by right-clicking. You can now paint with this brush and edit it using all of the parameters that we discussed earlier. Here I'm setting my opacity to pen pressure. I could maybe set the size to pen pressure and set a minimum diameter, maybe around 80%. This is essentially the hard round brush that I like to use to paint with. An important thing to note about brush stamps is that Photoshop interprets black as fully opaque and white as fully transparent. So if I were to invert this brush stamp so the border is black and the circle is white, define a brush preset, you can now see that this brush is painting opacity where the black border is and leaving the white circle transparent in the middle. Similarly, shades of gray will be interpreted at some level of opacity in between, depending on the value. The darker it is, the more opaque it will be. So if I take this value scale and define it as a brush preset, you can see that as I paint with this brush, the darker values on top are much more opaque, while the lighter values at the bottom are much more transparent. If I layer this with another color, you can very clearly see that the closer the stamp's values get towards white, the more transparent they become. So as you define your brush stamp, it's important to think about which parts of the stamp you want to be laying down paint and make those a darker value, and anything you want to be transparent, leave it as a lighter value or pure white. Now that we understand how Photoshop is going to interpret our brush stamp, we can try to create our own custom brush. If you want to, you can paint your own custom brush stamps by hand by using some of your existing custom brushes. If you combine various textures from different brushes in an interesting way, you might find you end up with a stamp that's useful for painting. An important thing to note is that you want your brush stamps to be large enough that they don't become blurry when you increase the brush size for high-resolution paintings. Right now when I select this brush stamp, it's about 1500 pixels wide. That might be a little larger than we need, but I would recommend keeping your brushes at least above 250 pixels. I tend to keep mine somewhere in the 500 pixel range. Once we have a stamp we like, we can simply go into Edit, Define Brush Preset, and we now have a new sampled brush based on this brush stamp. You can see when I paint with it, it's not very useful because I haven't applied any settings to it. But this is easy to fix. We could simply turn our spacing down a bit, add some nice opacity controlled by pen pressure, and because I want to avoid the repeating edge of this brush stamp, which looks very fake and digital, I'm going to turn on Shape Dynamics and set my angle control to Direction. Now the brush kind of swirls and changes direction somewhat based on the direction my brush is moving in. I might also add a nice texture to this brush to give it a little extra grit. And you can see with a few easy steps, we've created our very own custom brush that could be used for some kind of soft and textural surfaces. An important thing to note is that any of the parameters we change in our brush settings are non-destructive, meaning they will not be applied to the brush we created. If we open our brushes menu, you can see that none of the opacity control or texture have been applied to the original stamp. In order to save the edits we've made to our brush, we have to press this new brush icon and create a new brush set. And you can now see from the brush stroke preview, this brush has been saved forever with all the settings that we applied to it. So this was our original brush stamp, and this is the brush we created by adjusting our brush settings. Another fun way to create custom brushes is to use photo textures. It doesn't really matter where our brush stamp comes from, as long as it's composed of some interesting shapes and textures. So I pulled up a few images that I took on a trip to Norway a couple years ago, and I'm going to try to make a custom brush stamp out of these. I'm going to start with this rocky image, and I can press Ctrl U to bring up my hue saturation window, and bring the saturation all the way down. I'll grab another image here, and with this one I'll just press Ctrl Shift U, which will automatically desaturate the entire image. There's a lot of gray in both of these images, and I want to be sure the edges of my brush become transparent, so it's not obviously repeating any kind of square brush stamp edge. So I'll open up my Levels menu with Ctrl L, and adjust my sliders until I get a nice range of values from fully black to fully white. You can adjust this to taste depending on which part of the image you're trying to turn into a brush. I'll do the same thing with this forest photo over here. And for this one, I'm going to try and use the leaves to add a bit of extra texture. So I want it to be fairly light with the nice leaf grit showing through. I'll turn off this leaf layer for now and bring this rock image over. So there's some good shapes and values going on in this image, but it's not going to make a good brush stamp because the edges of this photo are so clearly visible and will create obvious repetitions if I try to paint with it. So instead, I want to focus in on these nice rocky shapes and create a good looking torn edge that won't look obviously digital when I paint with it. I'm going to lock the transparency of this layer by pressing this transparency checkerboard above the layers menu. You can also press / to turn transparency lock on and off. I'm then going to grab a soft round brush, select a medium to dark gray color, and set this brush to linear dodge. This will lighten all of the values that I paint over top of, allowing me to essentially erase out areas of detail that I don't want. I could do this with the eraser tool or simply painting with the brush using white, but using a mode like linear dodge allows me to preserve some of the textures and contrast. I'm going to switch to color dodge, which is an even higher contrast version of linear dodge, and begin erasing out more of these edges. So this is a pretty interesting stamp right here, but I think I can make it a little more interesting. I'm going to bring in this second photo to add some more complexity, and to mix the two together, I'm going to use blending modes. If I set the layer to multiply, all the white values will become transparent and the black values will remain opaque. If I set it to color dodge, the opposite happens, where my light values will remain and all of my dark values will be removed. So if I want to cut out some of the texture from my underlying brush stamp, I could use color dodge. If I want to add more texture using the dark values, I could use multiply. In this case, I think multiply will help me more, but I'm going to create a copy of this layer just in case by pressing Ctrl J, and now I have two versions of this same image. With my multiply layer, I'm going to lock the transparency of it, and again, begin painting out some of these edges. It's a subtle difference, but if I turn this layer on and off, you can see the texture of the second photo has filled in some of the gaps of the first photo, which I quite like. I think I might also want to break up some of these really solid dark shadows from the rocks in the first photo, which is why I saved the second layer, which I can now set to screen, or color dodge, or linear dodge, depending on how much contrast I want. In this case, I think screen is working best. So I'm going to select screen and move this image around until I like the effect of the texture over my brush stamp. I can then open my Levels menu again with Ctrl L and play with my contrast until I feel like I've gotten just the right amount of texture breakup that I want. Something like this looks pretty good to me, though I don't love this little extra bit on the left side of the brush. So I'm going to go to the layer that's on and simply paint it back out with my brush set to linear dodge. Once I have a nice clean brush stamp with no visible edges, I can grab my marquee tool by pressing M. I can make a box around the brush stamp and go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. And just like before, we now have a stamp of that shape that is being repeated over and over when we paint with our brush tool. Now this doesn't look too great as a brush yet, so we'll have to adjust our settings. For paintbrushes, I typically set both opacity and flow to pen pressure. This will definitely need some shape dynamics. I may want to control the angle of the brush by direction, but I still feel like I can see the brush stamp repeating, which is what I want to avoid. So I'll turn that off, and instead turn up angle jitter. Now it's much less obvious that this is a repeating brush stamp, and instead just looks like a very organic texture, which is great. I can probably push this even further though. Right now I feel like the brush is a bit too opaque with the angle jitter, so I'm going to increase the spacing a little bit, so there's a little bit more of a gap between each repeated brush stamp. I might also turn on scattering, since this is going in the direction of a texture brush. I don't want a lot of scattering, but 25% might do the trick. And to go the extra mile, I might also apply a texture to this brush. In this case, I'll change the mode to multiply, so dark values from my texture are being removed from the brush. And I'll have to do some experimenting to get this looking the way I want. The brighter I make the texture, the less the texture is being applied and the more the original brush is showing through. So I'm going to bring this down until the stroke preview looks about where I want it. And I may increase the contrast and the scale. And here, I've decreased the scale too much, and I'm beginning to see repetitions of the texture within the brush stroke, which again looks fake and digital. So I'm going to turn the scale back up, and that's feeling a little bit better, but it's definitely too strong for what I want. So I'm going to decrease the contrast quite a bit. That's feeling a little bit better. And maybe bring the brightness up, again, just to reduce the intensity of this texture. If I feel like I don't want to mess with all these brightness settings, I can also just decrease the depth slightly, which will reduce the amount of texture applied to the brush. And that's starting to feel like quite an interesting texture brush. So I'm happy with that, and I need to be sure to save my settings by opening my brushes menu, creating a new brush, and ideally giving it a nice name to stay organized. Now we can see, in just a few minutes, I've created a very nice texture brush that I could maybe use to tone a canvas or get started with a rocky cliffside texture. And then I could grab this softer texture brush that I painted by hand and maybe begin carving out some other shapes within it. The key to making digital art that doesn't look excessively digital is to use a wide variety of brushes that have a mixture of different kinds of textures and edges to them, so it's not obvious that it's the same brush repeated over and over. You don't need too many brushes to make digital art. I probably only have about 5 or 6 brushes that I use for the majority of my painting, and then a few specialty brushes that maybe make an appearance once or twice per painting. At the end of the day, you want to have just enough brushes to accomplish your painting tasks without having so many brushes that you're overwhelmed looking at your brush menu. With a small collection of well-curated brushes that you're very familiar with and know how to use, you can create any kind of digital art that you want to. A massive brush set is going to give you headaches more often than it's going to help you, so it's better to keep your collection small, make brushes that do exactly what you want them to do, and when you can't find brushes that do what you want them to do, you can make your own from scratch. This isn't a fantastic painting that I've done here, but you can see how easy it was for me to create a couple very simple brushes in just a few steps completely from scratch. I'm getting some nice textures out of them, and they're useful for a wide variety of painting tasks. Additionally, these are now brushes I have that no one else does, which won't make a huge difference in the quality of my artwork, but I might be able to get some interesting textures and effects that other artists don't have in their work. The combination of the brushes you choose to use can have a pretty big impact on your painting style, so be sure to curate your collection carefully and use brushes that have exactly the right effect you want. Your assignment for this lesson is to practice what we just went over and create a few of your own custom brushes. Try a variety of different methods for creating your initial brush stamp, and experiment with different brush settings and ways to make it more interesting. Don't worry if you don't end up creating your new favorite paintbrush. This is just an exercise to better understand how the brush engine works. The more familiar you are with the engine, the easier it will be to get exactly the kind of texture and style that you want in your paintings. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.